Hello, everyone, and welcome to tonight's presentation, Historic Ag Reserve Properties. Tonight, we are joined by our monthly host, Kenny Scholes. He's a longtime Poolesville resident who enjoys exploring ag reserve history and serves as a board member for the Montgomery Countryside Alliance. As I said, please remain muted during the presentation. You can feel free to post any questions in the chat, and we can read them at the end during the Q&A. If you enjoy tonight's performance, or I should say event, be sure to check out our website, poolesvilleseniors.org, and consider joining us for other events in the future. And without any further delay, Kenny, you can start.
Okay, great. Thanks so much. So let's see, I just shared my screen. So just give me a thumbs up that you can see this old black and white picture. Good. Okay, cool. All right, great. Well, it's great to be with you all. It looks like a smaller group tonight, which actually is a good thing, I think, just because it's kind of a tighter knit group. So if there are specific questions people have, you can wait till the end. You can put them in the chat. You can also feel free to just chime in as I'm talking. I've got no problem with that. And also, as we kind of go through this, I'm also happy to kind of go down any rabbit holes that anybody would like to do. That's also fine with me and sometimes enjoyable. So what I thought I would talk about tonight is this idea of chronolocating. I put that on Facebook today, and that's a very weird term. In fact, I think it's probably a made-up term. But I've seen this term show up in actually a bunch of different areas with people who try to understand change in a certain area using pictures taken at different times, also using maps. Actually, somebody, it sounds like someone's got a hot mic.
I just said to act like I was asleep.
I actually see this show up most frequently in military settings, and it's something that when I was in the Army we used frequently at a more kind of rapid pace, but to understand how terrain was changing and what that meant for us. So a good example of this was when I was in Iraq in 2008. A big problem we were dealing with was roadside bombs. They were everywhere. They were really, really hard to see on the ground. And so one of the tools and one of the things that we figured out that could be useful was, if you have a specific road that you're concerned about, you fly a plane down it, you take a whole bunch of pictures, and then the next day you go back and you do the exact same thing. And then you can look at those pictures and determine what has changed along the side of the road in the landscape to figure out, has something taken place, right? This change tells us a story. It tells us that somebody has come and done something in a certain spot. And in a similar way, but a little bit different here, less violent here, we can do the same with maps and overhead imagery of the ag reserve, not over a 24-hour period, but over decades, sometimes multiple decades, to understand and get a better picture of a story taking place. And so that's kind of what I wanted to talk through tonight. I wanted to talk kind of largely about Poolesville and some change, but then I want to show you a couple of really specific examples where I've been able to look at maps and overhead imagery through different time periods to see how the landscape has changed and kind of what that tells us about certain structures. So what you're looking at here, probably familiar to most of you, but this is Poolesville. So, can everybody, yeah, there we go. So on the left, what we have is Poolesville from 1951. And on the right, the same kind of elevation shot, but taken in 2020. And so certainly, at a just obvious level, there's a story to be told here. This is a story of a lot of things, one of which is growth. Clearly, we can see that the interior core of Poolesville there in the center on the left is largely intact. In the picture on the right, that's, it's basically that four-way stop sign. But there has been a lot of change out on the perimeter as we have expanded our footprint through time. If we look at this picture from 1951 again, we can see the Poolesville High School is here. There's no Westerly, the neighborhood that I live in. There's no Wesmond out here. There's no, this zone down here is kind of the turn on Fisher Avenue where the elementary school is. There's no elementary school here in 1951. None of these neighborhoods in the northern part of town are here, right? So we don't see a whole lot of detail aside from this small kind of village structure. If we start to kind of change our time period and we get to 1970, we start to see again, the high school's still here, but now the elementary school has shown up. The beginning of Westerly is being built and it's going to expand across the bottom of this picture. We still have no Wesmond out here on the far right side of the screen. And a lot of the neighborhoods that came later in the 90s and early 2000s are certainly not showing up here. 79, we see that Westerly has largely been completed. We can see it kind of the footprint taking shape. We've completed Wesmond. And the elementary school, take note of, if you look in 1970, it's like a C or a U shape here. If we look here in 1979, it's a complete squared kind of donut shape. So that again tells us a story about what took place at Poolesville Elementary between 1970 and 1979. It's one of addition. And I'll show you a close-up picture of what that looks like in a second. So when we look at this far right picture, this is from 1972. This is the elementary school, quite obviously, but it's an elementary school that is familiar, but pretty different from the one that we see today. So for one, what we don't have on the far left side of that picture is the gym and that whole hallway side of the elementary school, kind of completing, you know, this square shape. There's no where. For those of you who've been in the elementary school recently, the library is here, the gym is here, there's a bunch of classrooms. So none of that had been built, but 10 years from this point, it was there. We can also see that behind the school, there's essentially just fields. Now we know that there are townhouses back here on Kohlhaas. And we know that when we look at the front parking lot of the school, it's changed quite drastically as the population has expanded and the school has had to add more parking for teachers and also kind of redirect the routing for children drop off. If any of you have done that high stress adventure in the morning, it's much more organized now than it used to be because they've kind of made lanes to allow that to work more efficiently. When we look at the left, we can see homes in Westerly, and these homes at this stage are brand new. The earliest homes from Westerly are from somewhere between 1970 and 1972. So these are some of the newest ones. And you can kind of tell that these are new homes just in the sense that these yards are effectively bare, because essentially what happened was Westerly was built on top of what had been a cornfield. And so it's just basically flat. And so if you walk around Westerly now, there's lots of growth, lots of vegetation. That wasn't here yet. And then down in the bottom left, which I think is just a really interesting picture, this is actually Wayland Commons. This is kind of the field at the bottom part of the picture that all of the events were last weekend for Poolesville Day. And then these two homes, those of you know who Randy Davis, I know he's been on here a few times. This white home on the right, that's his house. And then there's the old kind of log structure home next to that. And then to the left of that today would be the new town hall, but of course it was not there in the 1970s. In 1980, we have this picture from the high school. This one's kind of funny because, to be honest with you, not much has changed here, right? Which is part of the reason why there is change taking place at the high school right now. The layout and the footprint of Poolesville High School had not really experienced much change from 1960s, 1970s onwards. But if we were to take this picture and sit it next to a picture of the high school in 2030, I would venture that we're going to see a significant amount of change, right? And so it's just kind of an interesting thing to keep in mind about how these structures have changed in the past, but also how they might change in the future to fit whatever the needs are of the town and local community. This picture is kind of cool too, just because you can see kind of the playing fields out here above the high school. And if you look out beyond that, it's just kind of open field or just kind of dense vegetation. This is where the I think General Custer Road is up there. And that section of homes that kind of now tie into Westerly, which you can see off on the upper far left of the screen. And again, just to kind of re-emphasize this point, we can see when we look at 1979 Poolesville, 2002 Poolesville, it doesn't at first glance look like too much change, but when you start to look at different sections, you'll see different parts of the town slowly being filled in with developments around that inner. And then where it gets really interesting is when we start to zoom in a little bit. And that's really what I wanted to kind of focus on tonight is this idea of zooming in on some specific areas or even specific structures. So when we look at specific neighborhoods, when we look at in 2008 on the left here, so not even that long ago, this is right across from the high school. This was all just farmland. I remember when I was at Poolesville High School, I graduated in 2002. That field across from the high school was just, I remember tractors there and corn and everything. Come 2020, it's Stony Springs, right? So there's been quite a change in that space. Similar with Brightwell Crossing as you're leaving town. I love this old farmhouse that's in 2008, very much sitting out on its own. I think this was associated with the Elgin family. Now today, it's still there, but it's a little bit surrounded by the neighborhood, right? The rest of the neighborhood is kind of filled in the area that this field made up in 2008. And then if we look at the reserve in Brightwell, in 2014, you can actually see the gas line going through here. It kind of runs diagonal. This was a place where I will say my friends used to go in high school to have bonfires and have a good time. I, of course, have never been there, but in 2020, that same line where the gas line runs parallel to where the new section of the reserve at Brightwell is being built. So it's interesting to see how this space has kind of filled in just in a 6-year span. Okay, so that's kind of looking at neighborhoods and different portions of around Poolesville. But what I really want to spend time looking at is a couple of really specific cases where we can kind of learn some interesting things about some structures here in the Ag Reserve. So where I want to start is right here. Hopefully you all can see this picture of this stone structure. For those of you who have been in Poolesville for a long time or who live in Hunter's Run, you've probably seen this before. So this is this old kind of stone ruin building in Hunter's Run. I just had somebody ask about this, I think on the town page recently, and I put a link to this in there, but I wanted to talk through it because I think it's a kind of interesting case study. So we've got in Hunter's Run, relatively new neighborhood from the early 90s. We've got this old stone structure, and very clearly this was built long before the 1990s. And the question is, what is it? What's the story with this place? What is it tied to? Okay. So just to kind of zoom out a little bit and show you what this looks like on the map, we've got Hoskinson Road running down, kind of runs downhill in Hunter's Run. We have Hillard Road here. And then you've got this stone structure sitting here. It's kind of next to that really nice big white home there. And then there's also this pond back behind it that you can kind of see from this portion of Hoskinson Road. It kind of looks downhill into here. Up close, this is what the structure looks like. So again, it's certainly not in a condition of anybody living there. There's no roof, but what we can see is that obviously there's a chimney. At some point there had been some kind of stove placed in front of the fireplace. We can tell that by that circular opening above there. And there's also windows here, which is interesting, right? Because that tells us, in addition to the fireplace, that it's more than just some kind of storage shed that was built. Okay. So generally what happens is when I see something like that, the first thing that I start to do is go to, there's a really great resource. It's known as Medusa, but it's a Maryland historic site where you can go and kind of look at a map of the area, and any historic designated spot or structure on the map will show up kind of with like a dot that you can click on, and you can get more information about whatever that structure is or was. And in this case, when I did that, there was a spot kind of in this general vicinity that shows up, and I clicked on that, and it tells me that the Frederick Poole homestead was here in this location. And it talks about an old farmhouse. Unfortunately, it's long gone, and it was not there when there was a survey done of this site in the 1970s. But it also tells us that there is a stone structure with a chimney, and that there's also a meat house, sometimes referred to as a smokehouse. And when the members of the historic board came out in the 70s to profile this site, they took these black and white photos, which are great. I wish there were more of them, but we can see what it looked like from the ground level in the 1970s. And you can see our little structure with the chimney there in the middle. It's actually on the left as well. That's the same structure. But in the 70s, very clearly, it was being used as a garage in some sense. There was a roof there. Looks like there was maybe some kind of sliding door on the front in some capacity. So it was in rough shape, but it was in better shape than it was today. And then we also see on the right, we see this smokehouse, which is no longer present. And so what I wanted to start doing was trying to figure out like what's the story with this place. What I really wanted to try to figure out is, are there any interesting pictures of the old farmhouse that had been there but is now clearly long gone? And so another resource that we have through the county is overhead imagery at different time periods, going back to 1951. And so what's really interesting is you can look at satellite imagery through time over Montgomery County, and again, spot those changes, which tell you about a story taking place. And so when we look over this area in 1951, this is the imagery we get. And I know it looks really grainy. That's how it looks, right? 1951 aerial imagery is not great. But what we can see here, and I've tried to annotate it on the right, is we've got on the far right, we've got actually Hughes Road. And then we've got this long driveway that comes down, and it kind of makes this kind of odd turn. And then it hits the main farmhouse building, and the stone structure is sitting right next to that farmhouse. Yeah, so somebody noted that they remember the cows grazing the fields next to Helmose Park. Yeah, I grew up right across the street from Helmose Park, and I remember growing up before Hunter's Run was there, that on the other side of the baseball fields at Helmose, it was like no man's land. There was a fence and you didn't go over there, and everybody said there was some mean farmer or something. I don't even remember. I just remember I was scared to cross that fence line. So it's funny that this is basically the area we're looking at. So anyway, so we see this in the 1950s, and then we can jump ahead to the 1970s, and the imagery gets a little bit clearer. Not too much change in what we see overhead. Still have Hughes Road out here. We have the driveway, although the pond behind the home shows up. So one thing we learn is that this pond is man-made, and it was made between 1951 and 1970. So it's kind of interesting. And then when we look again at the overhead in the 1990s, a lot has changed. So we still have Hughes Road running here, but now we've started to build Hunter's Run. This is really, really, really early days of building the homes. They had just been completed. And we still have the pond and the stone structure here. And so what's kind of happened here, and you can kind of see it, is the driveway for this farm had kind of run from Hughes straight through here, almost right underneath these new homes built along Hoskinson Road, up to the farmhouse. So the next thing that we can do is try to see if we can find any aerial pictures. And I've talked about this resource before, but it's one of my favorites to just waste a whole lot of time on, but it's called Vintage Aerial. And in the 1970s and early 1980s, to be honest, I'm not even sure why, but somebody flew a plane out of Frederick and took just a ton of pictures of structures all through the ag reserve. And I'm so glad they did, because what it has done is preserved just a ton of old structures. At least we kind of know what they look like from the air when we don't have pictures of them from the ground. What's hard about it is they are not in any way annotated. They are roughly kind of positioned where they are on the map, but it's by no means precise. And so to really kind of make use of this, you've got to really spend a lot of time going through it and spend time figuring out what it is you're looking at. And so I spent a lot of time going through photos in a general area from the 1970s, and I came across this picture. And this picture was interesting to me for two reasons. One was, if you look at kind of the driveway here, it kind of does this curve thing, almost like a V. And if you remember, when we were looking up here, there's kind of this V shape here, and we knew there was a barn down here, right? And so it kind of starts to match up. And then the other thing, like really, really little and kind of hard to see, is there's a little stone structure with a chimney there, kind of hiding out there next to the trees. And so, like, as soon as I saw that, I was, pretty confident this is our site. And now I'm hoping that this plane is going to fly in a complete circle and take pictures all around this, because the farmhouse might be tucked here in the trees somewhere, and hopefully a different angle will show it to us. So again, this is kind of what I was just talking about. We have kind of that curve in the driveway, and then we've got the stone structure. So more pictures are taken, but unfortunately, the actual old Frederick Pool farmhouse was gone by this point. And so as we come around, what we see here is this little kind of tenant farming house, that's what was there. Actually, I think this was 1980, but the farmhouse is gone. And as we continue to turn and take pictures, we can see closer pictures of it. So you can see, the farmhouse here, a bunch of old rusting cars back here, which is actually a pretty common sight at this time. There is this corn crib barn back here. And then in the very, very upper part, you can see the pond back there in the distance. And so starting to kind of dig in using some of the resources that Glenn Wallace has done a really good job of building into around here, which with the Find a Grave website, we can figure out a little bit more about Frederick Pool and Mary Pool. This was the couple, and that area is where they lived. That was their farmstead. And then, the question becomes, well, what is this structure here on the right? This is what we were looking at, that stone structure. And I mean, there's two possibilities. One is it could have been, it's too small to be Frederick Pool and his wife's actual home. We know that there were enslaved persons working at this farm. So it could either be an enslaved quarters, or it could be a summer kitchen. In the 1800s, in these homes, they would build the kitchen separate from the home because fires were so common, and you didn't want to burn down your house if you had a fire in your kitchen. If we look at the left, this is a summer kitchen at another local farm, the White Carlin farm. This is out in Boyd's, but you can see, I mean, just structure and shape and size. I mean, it's very, very similar. And so, I think I don't ultimately know what the overall use of this was. It could have been both, but one way or another, it was likely either a summer kitchen or an enslaved quarters. And you can see, here's some local pictures of enslaved quarters. This is out at Darnall Place. I would just note, kind of in a very similar way, we've got kind of that single window there in the center. And that's exactly what we had, if you remember, way up top here when we look at the structure here. So maybe evidence pointing towards the enslaved quarters. The other thing I would say about that is just it's interesting to think about as you drive through Westerly or Hunter's Run or wherever. You are on roads that are built on top of fields that have been here forever. that have a lot of stories before we ever got here, most of which we will never know, to include slavery, to include, Civil War movements, to include all kinds of things with, what it takes to raise a family at a farm in the middle of nowhere back then. And so, hopefully just going through this kind of causes you to think a little bit about what was here in this space before, and then also what will overhead imagery look like 200 years from now over this space, right? It probably won't look the same as this if, if history is any kind of teacher to us. So that's kind of an interesting one, local in town at Hunter's Run. The other one that is kind of fascinating is the William Pierre farm. So same that vintage aerial website that I was telling you about. This was kind of taking it from a different direction. I was scrolling through that website one day, and I knew generally the pictures had been taken over the Comus area. And I mean, not gonna surprise anybody. I mean, I know most of the old homes and what they look like from the exterior around here. And so it's pretty easy for me when I'm looking at these pictures to pretty quickly know which house it is that I'm looking at. And I saw this picture, and this home here surprised me because I don't recognize it at all. I've never seen this house before. And so I was thinking, it's weird that there's this house in the Comus area, which I've spent a lot of time in, and I don't recognize it. And then as I look closer, the other interesting thing here is if you look to the right, it's you got to spend a little time looking at it, but those are gravestones. This is a graveyard. I mean, you can almost see kind of the rectangular outlay of it and the stones standing up. And so that was that's a major clue. The only cemetery that I know of in the Comus area is the Pierre family cemetery. I've been to that cemetery. Actually, I recommend it to you all that you should go out and check it out. It's in this little neighborhood kind of at the base of Sugarloaf Mountain, right off this little public road. But there's no old house anywhere near that cemetery. There's nothing there. And so that kind of got me wondering. Here's the Pierre family cemetery. And you can see off in the woods behind, this is taken from the road, and you can see off in the woods behind it, there's nothing there. It's just kind of farmland and field. And so when we look at overhead imagery of that same spot, again, this is kind of that public road. This is overhead imagery of like today. The cemetery is in this red box. And off to the left here, there's nothing, but this is where that home would have been, based on that picture we have from the 1970s. And so again, we can go back and start to look at the overhead imagery in this area. Here's right over top of it in 1970. Or actually, I'm sorry, this is from 1979. It's very grainy, not very clear. There's some structures here, but that's about it. I can't make out any kind of cemetery or anything else. When we look at it in 1970, so actually going back further, we see kind of more structures, still really grainy, and there's kind of this weird, sometimes when they're piecing pictures together or taking them at certain angles, you get this weird kind of lighter refraction effect, so it kind of jumbles the picture a little bit, which is not super helpful. But so what we can start to do is think about looking into the records to see, is there some kind of structure here using that Medusa website? And when we do that, I learn about the Pierre family farm. And what was confusing about this is there is a James Pierre farm literally right across the road from this. But this was a farmhouse built for William Pierre. And when we start to look into the records, we come across these pictures of the home. And this is, quite clearly, if we go up again and we look at this shot here, you can see it's kind of this square shaped structure with like this, triangular roof with these dormer windows off of it. And when we look down here again, that's clearly the house. And we can start to kind of look into that. You can see Here is a shot taken from further off down the driveway. You can see the home there. And if you look kind of towards the center right of the screen, you can see one kind of clear gravestone marker there. And so this is the location. And so this is the Pierre family farm. The Pierre family was French. They actually came to this area in the late 1700s, bought up a lot of land, built a structure that was on this property as early as 1783, I believe. And there's even some belief in the records that perhaps this larger house that we see here was essentially just kind of expanded upon that initial 1783 structure. What's interesting is, you know, this site is up in Comus, and it's now this little neighborhood, a couple of really large houses. But in the 1970s, there was a company that built it, and they wanted to build a golf course right at the base of Sugarloaf Mountain. I'm not sure exactly what happened, but that plan fell through. To be honest with you, I'm pretty happy it fell through, because it's a really beautiful, rural, quiet area. But the neighborhood ended up coming in, and so the cemetery still sits there today, but there is literally no trace of any of these buildings here. So we kind of lose a little bit of that picture. But having the cemetery there is kind of nice. And the Pierre family in the 1940s actually left a fund to care for the cemetery perpetually. So I'm not exactly sure who's kind of responsible for executing that, but there are funds apparently to make sure that cemetery remains kept up. Okay. And then I will just do one more, and this one's kind of quick, but I think this is a cool one too. So the other kind of interesting thing to think about is if you go up into Dickerson and we think about the Dickerson generating plant up here right on the Potomac, this is a big footprint. It's a big structure. If you ever walked on the towpath next to this thing is massive. And, you know, it kind of makes you wonder what was here before this plant came along. And here's some overhead imagery of it. So you can see the plant here. You can see the Potomac River in the upper left. If you look closely, what you can see here is the main road. I think I want to say 109. If you're driving out towards Frederick, comes here, and then the blinking stoplight is right here, and you've got that sharp turn that goes out into Dickerson, and the kind of the little village of Dickerson's up here. And so yeah, so you can see it's a large footprint. But if we go back to 1951 and look over this exact same spot, what we can see is farmland. And we can also see little dots of structures and little driveways and road networks through here. Again, this is that 90-degree turn with the blinking light. If we look at this area in the 1860s, this is the Martinet and Bond map from 1865, we can see within this footprint a number of family names and homes. And when we look at it in the 1879 Hopkins Atlas map, we see even more homes and more roads running through here. So we know that there were homes and structures at this location that were lost when the Dickerson power plant was built. We also happen to know that there was a Trundle family cemetery located where the Dickerson power plant was, that was likely built on top of, and we've lost that cemetery, unfortunately. The other interesting area kind of across the road from the power plant, if you've ever driven out there, it's really odd looking, but it's like these mounds that kind of go up in like these berms. And my understanding of it, and I'm definitely no expert of it, but it's kind of the coal ash coming off the plant. They essentially bury it in these mounds. And so we've seen this footprint kind of grow, you know, over the last, I don't know, 30 or 40 years. And next to it, we've got kind of this interesting, I don't know, it's hard to tell from here, but you can see what used to be a driveway. It almost looks like an old tree-lined driveway. And it's interesting to look back at that. And so when we look back in the 1950s at that, this is that driveway. This is that farm. Okay. And clearly, you know, there's some structure here, but not quite as much as we see here in the 50s. If you drive down the road today, you will see this gate. It is here, and if you look through the gate, you will see what is clearly used to be a tree-lined driveway. The asphalt is long gone, but the trees that would have lined the driveway are still there. It's kind of fascinating. And that was the home of Dr. Shreve. And I'm going to jump down here. So if we zoom in at the end of that tree, what was a tree-lined driveway today, it looks something like this. There's a bunch of trailers. They're associated with the generating station. But if we go back to the early 90s, we can see that the home was there. So this was Dr. Shreve's home. So it was here in the 1990s. You can see, you know, the mounds here to the left are not there. But by, I think, 10 years after 1998, when I looked at it again at the overhead, it's gone. So somewhere between 93 and 98, this home was demolished. Yeah, and then again, just kind of a closer up shot of the generating plant. And then kind of from that same elevation or that same zoom in the 1950s, again, we can see some of these farms that had been here. So, you know, just an example of, you know, what happens when we build, and this is kind of a natural part of development and kind of needs of a local community. But, you know, unfortunately, especially just given when this took place, we have very little to no record on these structures, what they looked like, very little on who lived there, and the stories that were there. And so that's just, you know, something that, and I've said this many times before, but something that we should keep in mind as we look at building new things or demolishing other things, or, you know, just ensuring that we are doing what we can to, if nothing else, at least preserve the memory of these places, because they are important to understanding the culture and the people and the stories that were here before us and that will be here after us, right? So with that, I will stop talking and take any questions that you have.
Kenny, I have a question. The Dickerson power plant, Sugarloaf has that Linden Farm
Yeah.
barn. And up the road, I know they have the stone house that they rent out. Have you
Yeah.
ever seen? Yeah. Do you know what was that? That is not an old structure, or is it? I don't know.
So that's a good question. I don't think it's, you know, I think it's 1900s. You know, I don't think it's more than 120 years old, but it's a really cool house. I mean, it's pure.
Yeah, it is.
I know exactly what you're talking
Yeah.
about.
Yeah.
Yeah. But I don't know too much about that. I didn't realize it was rented out, but
Yeah.
is that owned by Sugarloaf?
Well, the county is part of the settlement agreement that they have the house. I believe the house was given to Sugarloaf and they use it as rental property.
Okay, got it. Okay.
From what I remember.
Interesting. Okay. Makes sense.
Yeah.
I didn't realize that.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, actually the Linden Farm is an interesting one too, because
Yeah,
again,
it is.
that's the barn, but that was used there. But that was a beautiful old farmhouse that we do actually have a lot of pictures of, that unfortunately was kind of left abandoned and burned down, I think maybe in the 90s.
Yeah, it was demolition by neglect from the
Yeah.
county.
Yeah, which unfortunately is, you know,
Yeah.
something that happens too frequently.
But they did save the little board and batten house that's on that property.
Yeah. Yeah.
Sugarloaf was able to save that.
Here, I just want to show that to everybody, because I almost showed that tonight because I think it's a really cool one. So this was the Lawrence White Farm, also known as Linden.
There it is.
And yeah, I mean, it was a beautiful old farmhouse. You can see here, it actually looks really, really similar to a couple of, I've talked about the Evans home here in town, kind of next to Locals, that old White House. It's very, very similar to it. You can see in this center picture, which is kind of, no, it's not gonna let me zoom in, but that's from that airplane, you know, service that took those pictures. You can see it there on the left. But yeah, and I mean, beautiful porch and everything, but unfortunately, we boarded up and then burned down.
Yeah, and that was my grandparents' farm.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Matthews, yeah.
Yeah.
And the stone house that you're talking about, between Linden Farm and the power plant, is that
Yeah.
the one you're talking about?
Yes,
Yeah.
yes.
That was actually built by my grandparents for
Oh,
my
wow.
uncle, Edwin Matthews. And I think that was in like the 1940s that
Okay.
house.
Okay,
Yeah, that
Okay.
makes
Yeah,
sense.
so it's not a very old house,
Yeah.
right.
but it's built from stones from the
Yeah, it's
farm.
beautiful.
That farm
It's
was
a-
very stony.
It's
Yeah.
a beautiful home.
So have you been to where this farmhouse was? I'm sure you've been up there, but if the driveway is still there.
Yes, it is.
And I don't know if it's your dad or your grandfather
My
carved
grandparents.
their initials into the cement. Okay, so they're still there. You should really go check it out. It's really, really cool.
Okay.
Yeah, it's like I think they carved it in like it's old, but it's still there in kind of the grass there, and it's kind of neat to look at.
Yeah. Yeah, that was a beautiful farmhouse. Just
It is.
gorgeous.
Yeah,
It was
really
tragic when it burned down.
Yeah.
I heard it was arson, but I'm not sure.
Yeah, that's my understanding of it too, but I don't know too much about it. Yeah.
It looks like somebody wants to know when the Dickerson power plant was built.
Yeah, I think it's 1950s time frame. But it like a lot of things, I mean, it really kind of came in segments. The initial kind of footprint of it was right up along the river, and then it kind of expanded over a number of decades. But yeah, 1950s was when it first really went in there.
So I just want to mention that one of our next big events is going to be held at the Linden Farm house or the barn with our pig roast and line dancing.
Oh, cool.
So that's coming up on October 15th. And so great seeing pictures of it. And
Yeah,
that's where we're holding our next big event.
cool.
So it should be fun.
Yeah, actually, that's where the ride for the reserve on Sunday is actually kind of based out of there as well. So that'll be cool too.
Does anyone have any other questions that they'd like to ask? Or type and I can read it. All right. Well, I definitely wanted to tell Kenny, thank you so much for being here with us.
Yeah.
It's always a pleasure to have you. And it's so interesting to learn about the area. I know I personally haven't lived here very long, but it's really interesting to hear all the history that you have to offer.
Really, yeah. Thanks for having me.
And, if you enjoyed this event, we do have some other upcoming events. As Melissa mentioned, we have a pig roast at Linden Farm on October 15th at 6 o'clock in Dickerson. And we also have another in-person event for advances in medicine during the Civil War. And that's going to be at the Poolesville Presbyterian Church. And that will be the 27th at 7 o'clock. So make sure you go to our website and register for those or other events that you might find interesting. And that's poolesvilleseniors.org. And you can always feel free to email us if you have questions at info@poolesvilleseniors.org. And if you want to unmute and say, goodbye to Kenny, thank you, you can do that now.
Thanks, Kenny.
Thank you, Kenny.
Good seeing you.
Thank you as always.
Yeah, good
Yeah,
seeing
these are always great. Thank you.
Really enjoyed.
Thank you, Kenny. Good information.
you. Yeah, absolutely. Thanks.
Thank you all for coming.
All right, thanks. Good night.
Good night.
Good night.